care of that and show my screen. Now you should be able to see the information that you can write down in case you're having any audio difficulties. So you can then listen on your phone while viewing the broadcast on your computer. As you have questions for the presenters, type them into the question box, and the presenters will answer them at the end. Before we turn the time over to our panelists, I wanted to introduce you to the Dibble Institute. So here on the screen is Charlie Dibble, and he's the one who founded the Dibble Institute. Charlie's story is very inspiring, and you can learn more about him and his story on our website. The Dibble Institute is a national independent nonprofit organization dedicated to equipping teens and young adults with the skills and knowledge they need to develop healthy romantic relationships now and in the future. So without further ado, let me introduce you to our two panelists. Alyssa Goldman and Jessica Gosa both work for Concept Systems. Concept Systems was contracted by the U.S. Department of Justice to write a report to better understand how youth conceptualize teen dating and teen dating violence. We're very excited to hear Alyssa and Jessica tell us more about what they learned.
Good afternoon. My name is Alyssa Goldman, and I'm here with my colleague Jessica Gosa, and we are both client services consultants with Concept Systems located in Ithaca, New York. And we have both been managing a project for the past few years with the National Institute of Justice, the purpose of which is to better understand the extent to which youth and adults conceptualize teen dating relationships in a similar way. So in today's presentation, we're going to do a few things. We're first going to talk a little bit about the need for this study and why this project came about with regard specifically to better understanding and advancing our approaches to teen dating violence, research, practice, and programming. We're then going to dive into the actual meat of this study that we've been working on for the past 4 years. It was 2 parts, and the second part was designed to complement the results of the first section. So we'll take you through both of the process and the results for both of those pieces. And then we're going to conclude with talking a little bit about how the results from this project, how we see them as being able to shape future work around teen dating violence research and programming, and also talk a little bit about some work that's currently ongoing to address some of the questions that came out of this study. Okay. I'm going to start with a little bit of background about teen dating violence. Teen dating violence has surfaced as a significant public health issue, specifically within the past 10 years when teen dating violence became something that was specifically measured through the Youth Risk Behavior Survey. And so through this survey, you see here in 2011, nearly 10% of high school students reported being physically abused by their dating partner in the past year. And 1 in 5 women and 1 in 7 men that have ever experienced rape, physical violence, or stalking by their partner first experienced partner violence between the ages of 11 and 17. So the implications of teen dating violence extend not only to the adolescent years, but also beyond into later life. One of the reasons that we undertook this project was because most of the research and the programming around teen dating violence today is really rooted in what adults think youth think. So there's very little research that's directly looking at the extent to which the assumptions that adults have that really guide research and practice today actually align with youth experiences. And when we say adults here, we really mean professionals in the field. So researchers, practitioners, advocates, teachers that are really championing teen dating violence work. So given that we know little about how youth actually think about teen dating relationships and how they value those aspects, and the extent to which youth conceptualizations align with adult assumptions, we wanted to take this opportunity to use this project to directly examine and compare youth and adult perspectives. And given that teen dating relationships are the context of teen dating violence, we thought that better understanding this context would essentially allow us to better understand teen dating violence and ultimately improve how we are able to prevent and address this issue. We had a number of people involved in this study over the past few years. You'll see that the outer ring here, funders, this project was funded by the Department of Justice and the Department of Health and Human Services. And then the next layer in, we had this interagency work group on teen dating violence. And this work group was in existence long before this project and is essentially comprised of representatives from a number of federal agencies that have do various pieces of work around adolescent development and teen dating violence specifically. And they really helped to guide this project in terms of helping us with participant recruitment and also receiving the results and looking ahead to what can be done next. And then the next layer in, we had our advisory group. And this group consisted of researchers and representatives from various federal agencies and other experts that were able to help the planning group, which really comprised the core of this project along the way, in thinking about key issues around study design, methodology, and participant engagement. And then, as I already mentioned, we had the planning group that comprised really the core of this project, and that consisted of the study leads of the National Institute of Justice and also representatives from HHS and CDC and practitioners that all worked in some area of adolescent development, advocacy, and practice. So I mentioned that this study consisted of two parts. The first part was we used a method called group concept mapping. And I'll talk more about the process, but the goal of using group concept mapping here was essentially to collect the opinions and perspectives of youth and adults on teen dating violence in a really systematic way. And that would also then allow us to easily go back to youth and adults with the results and ask for their opinions. And that iteration of going back to youth and adults essentially comprises the second phase of this study, the facilitated discussions. And those are very similar to focus groups. We basically took the results of the concept map back out to have some face-to-face discussions with youth and adult groups in various parts of the country, and to better understand the extent to which the maps actually represented accurately their understanding of teen dating relationships. So why did we use the group concept mapping method? Well, there were a few reasons, and I've touched on a few of them already. But the group concept mapping really provided a systematic way to capture, compare, and represent the perspectives from many individuals in various locations and with presumably very diverse experiences and opinions that might impact how they understand teen dating relationships. As I'll show you in a minute, the steps in the group concept mapping process are relatively simple to the extent that youth would be allowed to fully participate, and we would be able to capture their understanding of this issue to the same extent that we would of adults. As you'll also see, the visual results that came out of this process were then quite easy for youth to interpret and talk about, so that we were really able to get their feedback as to the extent to which this concept map, as we call the result, provide an accurate picture of their understanding of teen dating relationships, and that we could then use this as a pretty robust basis for future work in the field. So here is a snapshot of the steps in the group concept mapping process. Step number one, we do quite a bit of planning. This involves identifying who we want to take part. We also develop a single question that guides all of the content of the concept mapping process. We call this question a focus prompt, and we'll show you the one we use for this project in a minute. But a focus prompt is essentially an open-ended question, an open-ended sentence that's designed to have participants complete based on their own opinions. And that process essentially constitutes the idea generation phase, where participants provide us with their responses in response to the focus prompt. After we collect all of these ideas, the planning group then meets and reviews the ideas for redundancy, clarity, and ultimately reduces what is usually a very large set of ideas from participants to a smaller set of 100 that represent all of the opinions that came in through the idea generation process. Number 4, structuring ideas. We then take that final set of 100 ideas back to our participant groups. We ask them to sort the ideas into groups, into piles, we call them, in a way that makes sense to them. And we also ask them to rate the ideas on one or more scales that are designed to capture their opinions or how they value each of the ideas. 5th, we analyze the data from the sorting and rating activities and use this as the input to then create the maps that are the representations.
All right, we need that. We'll leave it going.
Process. And then finally, we bring the results back out to our participant planning group and ask for their interpretation and recommendations as to how the results of the concept map can effectively be used. So I'm going to go through each of these 6 steps and tell you a little bit more in detail about how we use this approach through this project specifically. So first we had planning, and I mentioned that participant recruitment is one of the 2 key aspects of the planning process in concept mapping. We aim to recruit 2 groups of youth to participate in this project. The first we refer to as teens, ages 14 to 18, essentially youth that would be high school age. And then the second group was young adults, ages 19 to 22, that would presumably have graduated from high school or either be in college or working, but no longer in sort of the high school environment. And we'll talk later about why that was an important perspective to capture. We recruited both of these, the teens and young adults were both recruited through youth serving organizations. And when I say youth serving organizations, I'm basically referring to existing groups like community centers, job training, groups on college campuses, groups, religious organizations. We wanted to really get at a variety of groups, and not necessarily groups whose objective or part of their mission is to really help educate youth about healthy relationships. We wanted to try to use this recruitment approach to really capture a variety of focus. And then we had the adults that we also recruited, and these were professionals in the field. And as I mentioned, these largely included researchers, practitioners, advocates, teachers, and some federal employees. The second part of the planning process, in addition to participant recruitment, is developing the focus prompt. And as I mentioned, the focus prompt is really this key driver in collecting the content that ultimately comprises the map. And this comes directly from the project aim. So as you'll see here on this slide, given that the project aim was to use group concept mapping to better understand how youth and adults conceptualize healthy and unhealthy aspects of teen dating relationships, our focus prompt was a thought, action, feeling, or behavior that teens in dating relationships might have or do is. So you'll notice this is an incomplete sentence that we then asked the teens, young adults, and adults to give us their feedback as to what could complete this sentence. And so that activity of bringing this focus prompt out to all of these participants is the idea generation phase. And now, given that we were working with professionals and youth in various parts of the country and in through various organizations, we provided a number of means for participating. We had a website where people could just log on to the site and anonymously contribute their ideas. We also had a phone number where youth especially used this means to just text us their idea, and that was also anonymous. And then for some groups, we provided postcards where they could just the youth organizer could just hand out the postcards, and youth could just fill them in with their ideas, and then they would be mailed back to us. So as you can imagine, we collected quite a few ideas. We had actually well over 600 from all participant groups together. And you can see from the breakdown here on the screen that we had fairly decent representation from all three groups. So after collecting over 600 ideas, our next task was to reduce this large amount of ideas to a final set of 100 that could sufficiently represent the breadth of the original set that came in. So there was considerable redundancy among these ideas. Some ideas were more specific versions of other ideas and so forth. So we worked with our planning group to work through the different themes that came out of these ideas, and then ultimately arrive at our final set of 100 that we felt best represented the original set of 600. Once we had our set of 100 ideas that I just want to reiterate came directly from the youth and adult participants, we then took those ideas back out to our participant groups and asked them to individually sort those 100 ideas into piles in whatever way made sense to them, that best reflected their understanding of the similarity and the relatedness of those 100 ideas to one another. So what you're seeing on your screen now on the left-hand side here is essentially how this sorting activity looks to most people who completed this via a dedicated project website. In some cases, we did physically meet with youth and give them paper cards to do the sorting, but by and large, most people completed this using the computer. And you can see here that each idea is basically on a card, which participants would then drag and drop to the white space to form their piles. In addition to sorting, we also asked our youth and professional participants to rate each idea on how frequent they thought it was in teen dating relationships, and also how desirable they thought it to be in teen dating relationships. So there were 2 rating scales, and we had over 350 people combined, youth and adults combined, take part in this activity. So after we collected over 130 sorts and 350 ratings from participants, we aggregated that data into a similarity matrix and subjected it to multidimensional scaling, the results of which is what you're seeing on your screen now. So this looks somewhat like a connect the dots diagram, but what this is really showing you is the aggregated perspective of all of the individuals that completed the sorting and how they see each of these 100 ideas as related to one another. So if you were to look really closely at this picture, you would be able to pick out numbers 1 through 100, each of which represents one of the ideas that was generated through the idea generation phase. And as you'll see here, each of the numbers represents one of those 100 ideas. What's also important through this, we call this the point map, what's also important to look at here is the relative distance or proximity between each of the ideas. Proximity here indicates how the group as a whole, so how youth and adults as a whole, thought of the ideas as related to one another. So here's an example. If you look in the purple box at the top of the screen, we call this the northern area of the map. You'll see that bunched together really closely are ideas 35, 38, 74, 98, which are smiling and laughing, kissing, loving each other, and cuddling. So these ideas appeared very close to one another because our youth and adult participants tended to agree that these ideas were similar in meaning in the context of teen dating relationships. Down in the southern area of the map, you'll see idea number 99, hitting, slapping, shoving. And notice how this idea is almost as far as it could possibly be from those ideas in the purple. And that basically indicates that participants felt that this idea perhaps not very surprisingly, is quite similar conceptually, quite dissimilar conceptually from the ideas in purple. So whereas the ones in purple tend to be positive aspects of relationship, hitting, slapping, shoving was seen as a negative and unhealthy characteristic, and therefore appears quite far from the ideas in purple. And then over on the West Coast here, we have idea number 22, worrying what their family will think of their partner. And just to preview, this area of the map tends to represent a lot of social concerns and social anxieties, and therefore kind of constitutes its own area of the map, distinct from the abusive aspects and distinct from some of the more positive aspects. So just to reiterate, this point map is really the foundation of the concept map results, given that it represents this aggregated group perspective of how all of these ideas relate to each other. So what you're looking at now is what we call the cluster map. And this is, none of the points have moved from the last picture I showed you. The points are in the exact same position with regard to one another. What we do here is we cluster the ideas so that we don't have to really think about how the placement of each of the 100 ideas. We can think about them in sort of territories of thematically similar ideas. So we apply cluster analysis and we review multiple arrangements of the ideas in different clustering arrangements. And ultimately, in this case, a 9 cluster map best represented how youth and adults thought of the ideas as related to each other in higher order themes. And what we're showing you now is the labeled cluster map. So these labels, and I'll just mention that when I talk a little bit more about the facilitated discussions, I'll say this again, but all of the labels you're looking at came out of the results of the facilitated discussions. So one of the big purposes of that second phase was to take the map out to youth and adult participants and ask them how they felt we should label each of these territories of the map based on the specific ideas in each of the clusters. So you can see here that positive communication and connection is where we saw those ideas that we showed you earlier in purple. We have early stage of relationship just below that. We have signs of commitment over in the top left area. And then towards the bottom, we start to see things like insecurities, warning signs, abuse. So just as with the point map, where each of the ideas were close to one another or farther from one another based on similarity and meaning, you can see the same thing happens here with the cluster map. And we actually had youth identify the map with regard to 2 dimensions, we call them. So youth told us when we brought these results out to them that as the content moved from north to south, they saw this as moving from healthy to unhealthy. And as the content moves from east to west, youth felt that the ideas on the west tended to be more related to external or public behaviors, whereas those towards the eastern coast of the map were more relevant to emotions or feelings, things that were more personal to the individual or internal, as they called them. So there were definitely these patterns in how the ideas were arranged that teens and young adults picked up on and were able to articulate. So all of the results I've showed you so far, the point map, the cluster map, the dimensions, these all came out of the sorting activity where participants sorted the ideas into tiles. But you'll recall that we also asked participants to rate each of the ideas on how frequent and how desirable they thought them to be in teen dating relationships. So what we're showing you now is what we call a pattern match or a ladder graph. And so you'll see that on either side is a list of each of those 9 cluster labels. We have the results of the adult's perspective on the frequency of the ideas on the left-hand side, and the results of the teens and young adults on the left-hand side, or depending on how you're looking at it, actually the adults are on the left and the youth are on the right. But you can see the labels, that they're each on their own side, and the ordering that you're seeing of the clusters here is representing the relative frequency of the ideas in each of these clusters based on the ratings of only adults on the adult side and only youth on the teens and young adult side. So for adults, early stage of relationship appears at the top because on average, adults saw those ideas as most frequent in teen dating relationships. And for the youth, positive communication and connection appears at the top because youth on average felt that the ideas in that cluster were most frequent in teen dating relationships. So what we take from this figure is actually a lot of similarity in how these clusters are ranked relative to one another. We see that both groups see abuse at the bottom as the least frequent relative to the other clusters. And even though there are some slight differences with the clusters that were seen as more frequent at the top, overall the top four are the same. So both youth and adults agree that the ideas in early stage of a relationship, positive communication, intense focus, and signs of commitment, there's agreement among all participants that these are the most frequent. And we'll just point out that insecurities, the ideas that comprise that cluster, there was a statistically significant difference in the extent to which adults saw those ideas as more frequent and youth and young adults as less frequent. And then here is showing you the same picture, well, the same type of picture, a pattern match, but here we're looking at desirability instead of frequency. So again, we notice a lot of similarity. We see positive communication, signs of commitment, early stage of a relationship is the top three overall in terms of how desirable the ideas in these clusters are in a teen dating relationship. And at the bottom, we have abuse, dependency, warning signs, insecurities, social concerns and consequences, and intense focus on the relationship. These were seen, they fall towards the bottom of this pattern match or this ladder up because they were seen overall by all participants as relatively less desirable. And I'll just point out that you can see at the bottom of this picture, there's the R equals 0.99. And this is just a correlation between, at the cluster level. And it's a correlation between -1 and 1, where 1 would equal perfect agreement between the two groups. And you can see here that with 0.99, this is indicating very strong agreement among teens and young adults, youth and adults, on the desirability of the ideas in these clusters. So we could break down the results of the ratings in many different ways based on some of the demographic information that participants provided to us at sorting and rating. And we're just showing you them in a sort of condensed form here because the overall takeaway from this is that agreement was very strong. We looked at teens versus young adults. We looked at white compared to black teens and young adults, females compared to males, relatively urban locations compared to relatively rural locations, and among the adults, we looked at how researchers' opinions compared to those of practitioners and advocates. And you can see that all of these correlations are very close to 1, which would be perfect. So really strong agreement among all participants as to the frequency and desirability of these ideas. Okay. So the map and the pattern matches that I just showed you essentially comprise the first phase of this project. And our preliminary takeaways included, well, first of all, which we already mentioned, that the opinions are very strongly correlated across the board, which suggests agreement both in terms of the ratings, but also in terms of the sorting. So when we went into this project, we weren't sure if we would need to potentially create 3 separate maps representing the perspectives of each of the 3 groups, the teens, young adults, and adults, or if we would be able to create 1. And so given that all 3 groups' perspectives were really harmonized in a single map, we basically also took away from this first phase that there also tends to be agreement at the conceptual level, not only at the ratings level. There were some variations in the locations of the central ideas in the map, and this basically had to do with ideas like For example, there's an idea in the center that has to do with one partner texting another partner quite a bit, and the youth tend to see that idea as more positive, whereas adults tended to see it as more negative. But because it's in the center, that also tends to signify that there were mixed opinions on the conceptual placement of that idea. So moving into the part 2 of the results, after we had the concept mapping, the map and the ratings results, we took these back out to youth and adults to conduct some discussions similar to focus groups so that we could better validate and augment the results for future use in a more practical way. So we wanted to better understand how well the map could be interpreted by researchers in the field, practitioners in the field, and also how well the map resonated with youth. We also wanted to use these discussions as an opportunity to include a broader sample of youth that were not necessarily included in the concept map. So these included some LGBTQ groups, youth in foster care or in transitional housing, and also more young men. And then we also wanted to specifically ask professionals in the field how they saw these results as relevant to their specific areas of work. So who participated? Again, the adult professionals tended to include similar individuals as participated in the concept mapping. We conducted 5 discussions total via webinar, each with about 10 participants. Youth and young adult discussions, we conducted 8 total, and we conducted all of these in person, face-to-face, and these included youth from Hayward, California, Boise, Idaho, Western Massachusetts, Ann Arbor, and Austin. We're just going to go over some of the key results from these discussions. Among the adults, there was overall agreement that among adults that the agreement that came out of the concept map between youth and adults was really encouraging. And it basically signifying that efforts today are basically on the right track in terms of a lot of the assumptions that underpin the research and practice efforts. The map included both positive and negative ideas, and this was discussed among adults as a particularly important thing to pay attention to. So many prevention programs focus specifically on the negative aspects and not enough on the positive aspects of relationships and identifying for youth what those are, what those look like, and how to work towards those. The cluster map itself was discussed as potentially a useful framework for communicating with youth, and especially this was a result of the first phase as a whole, because as we'll show you on the next slide, youth also tended to find this map, to validate this map as representing their experiences and perspectives with teen dating relationships, which further emphasizes the utility of the map as a potential communication framework for practice. The complexity of the map was also discussed among adults as a really interesting finding, so that teen dating relationships are not static, but they're actually pretty dynamic, and they evolve, and they don't just stay in one phase, but they could actually move around to different areas of the map. So what might be a positive or healthy one day can also include some negative aspects another day. And also that the teen dating relationships and teen dating violence shouldn't necessarily be thought of only in behavioral terms. The items on the map included a lot of cognitive and emotional aspects, not just sort of the physical behaviors that tend to be identified in research or measured through research and talked about in education. From the youth discussions, as I mentioned, one of the really encouraging findings was overall agreement across the board on all youth groups. The map was a solid representation of how they think about teen dating relationships. Some other interesting things that came out of the youth discussions, youth tended to discuss the clusters as stages or types of relationships. And so when we would go through the clusters with the youth groups, a lot of them would refer to the positive or healthier aspects as the beginning, and then a middle, and then an end. But at the same time, a lot of our groups also recognize the fact that real relationships do not just include elements of one of these clusters or two of these clusters, but that actual relationships tend to have aspects of many of these clusters simultaneously. Peers were emphasized as a major frame of reference in terms of whether one dates, who one dates, and that adults are not looked to often for advice in that area. Dating experience was discussed extensively among our young adults as a key factor in shaping their perspective of what a healthy relationship is. So many of our young adults refer back to high school years or middle school years as particularly formative in shaping how they think about relationships today. There was also a lot of context dependency, so things like arguing and getting text all the time that might have been rated as less desirable. A lot of youth also mentioned that some of these things can just be thought of as normal aspects of relationship, and that maybe do need to be contextualized if they're going to be thought about as negative or unhealthy. A lot of teens and young adults emphasized high school as a really intense context, and that it's really difficult to have a perspective on teen dating relationships that isn't heavily influenced by, we heard a lot, quote unquote, the drama of high school, and that this is a particularly influential scene for shaping youth perspectives and decisions around dating. Gender stereotypes came up a little bit, and they came up more in some of the work we're doing now. But some youth did talk about how decisions around dating behaviors and emotions, particularly violent behaviors, really had to do with gender a lot of the times, especially in terms of help-seeking behavior. Social media was discussed quite a bit as a big part of teen dating relationships, and also ties in heavily to the peer context. And then challenges around self-awareness. A lot of youth talked about how, and young adults especially, how it's much easier to look back on prior relationships and see what went wrong or what could have gone better than it is to realize these things while you're in the relationship. And then finally, something we heard again and again was that adults in their community, including teachers, practitioners, but also parents, there was a sense that their relationships were not taken seriously. So this concludes my part of discussing this first phase, and I'm going to turn it over to Jessica now, who's going to talk to you about some of the work that we've been doing since this study.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Alyssa. So I'm going to give you an update of where we are to date, and then Alyssa will circle back to you at the end and talk about some of the recommendations for the next steps and where we'll go after this. Okay. So the planning group and NIJ study leads determined that it would be very beneficial and of value to conduct additional discussion groups, basically to broaden the scope of the first discussions. So the key objective was to consider generalizability of the map with a more purposeful sample. This mostly took place this past fall into December, where we reached out to youth organizations representing underrepresented youth, as well as organizations in both rural and urban communities. To date, we have conducted 4 youth discussion groups, which were teen groups and young adult groups, in West Virginia, specifically Morgantown, West Virginia, and Fairmont, and Denver, Colorado as well. It was also determined that it would be of significant value to complete additional adult groups with individuals that work with youth that are not necessarily in the role of teen dating violence prevention work. We're currently in the process of finalizing those 2 groups, which we'll be looking to conduct a group with a group of service providers, the individuals that work with youth, and then also a group of teachers and coaches. So in the second set of youth discussions that I'm talking about, there were some emerging ideas that came out, and I have them listed here for you. The discussion of marriage as being a more beneficial relationship arrangement for men than women, that was mentioned. Sex was discussed far less frequently outside of the MAP statement specific to the topic compared to previous discussions. The concept of maturity was more frequently discussed, often in relation to explaining teens' challenges in identifying abuse. There was reference to shifting priorities of youth when they leave high school, which was described as key point about why high school environment is challenging in maintaining healthy relationships. And then the influence of culture and religion was an interesting discussion that was briefly noted in one of the young adult groups. Participants noted that religion can greatly impact how families approach and think about teen dating relationships. So as I mentioned, we will be looking to finalize those next 2 adult groups, which will take place this month and maybe the beginning of next month. And that will conclude our facilitated discussions. I'm going to let Alyssa go ahead and take it away to wrap up our presentation today, and she'll go ahead and lead you through what some of the recommendations for next steps are.
Okay. So I just have 2 final slides here. The first is just suggesting some research recommendations, and then the second, some practice and programming. In terms of research, we aim to further investigate the generalizability of the MAP with a broader and more representative sample of youth, particularly in cases where we think life circumstances might impact or affect perspectives on violence and teen dating in general. And then, given that I had mentioned earlier that the MAP included not only behavioral items, but also extensive cognitive and emotional items, we recommend that researchers consider incorporating these items into existing scales that are intended to measure teen dating violence prevalence and incidence. We also had youth talk a bit about the positive and negative items co-occurring with one another and not necessarily only happening apart from one another, so that a given relationship includes healthy and unhealthy aspects all the time. And so, like the prior recommendation, we're suggesting that researchers develop more sensitive measures around the complexities that underlie perpetration, and also just more comprehensively overall capture relevant aspects of teen dating relationships. And then finally, in practice and programming, we, like the research recommendations, are suggesting that practitioners consider focusing more comprehensively on what relationships include. So not only focusing on the negative, but also helping educate youth about the positive and what a healthy relationship might look like and ways to strive for and support those. As with the co-occurrence recommendation, we also are suggesting that youth programs also consider helping youth navigate the balance between positive and negative aspects in their own relationships, so that they can better identify when a warning sign really is a warning sign, or whether something like an argument might be more of a quote-unquote normal aspect of a relationship. Communication skill building is also one of our recommendations, particularly given how well the MAP content resonated with youth. We think that a lot of the specific ideas on the MAP and the concepts themselves could be used with parents and practitioners to communicate with youth around the topic of teen dating relationships and violence. And then our last recommendation is just to also consider social media and technology as a key context of teen dating relationships. We heard again and again that many interactions around this issue take place through these means and not always in person or face to face. So this concludes our presentation, and we also realized that if any of you are interested in seeing the specific ideas that are in the map in each of the clusters, we can definitely provide those or have a link of this full report distributed. But in the meantime, we'll just stop here and take any questions that anyone has.
All right, thank you, Jessica and Alyssa. Actually, I personally ended up learning a lot, and so let me check on any of the questions, and then while I'm checking on the questions, so Jessica and Alyssa, if you wanted to follow up with anything while I'm looking through some of these questions, that'd be great. So did you guys have any other thoughts?
I don't think that we have any additional thoughts, but just one correction that I wanted to note is that we did end up, I think we said in our second set of adult discussions, we went to Portland, Maine, and we actually ended up getting snowed out and were unable to get to Portland, Maine. So instead, our adult discussions were concluded. We did one right here in Ithaca, New York. And our second adult discussion took place in rural Pennsylvania, and they were both wonderful, but just wanted to give that update.
And then any other suggestions that you might have? So one of the questions is specifically for people who are currently using, so for example, a lot of the people on the call are using some of the DIBBLE materials, and the DIBBLE materials do cover a lot of the things that you talked about. But specifically, it's about the positive, healthy relationships and how important that was. Did you find out anything else in terms of how important it is to be teaching both the positive side of what is a healthy relationship as well as covering the dating violence side of it?
Yeah, so that was emphasized throughout a lot of our youth groups, and also something that really struck with the adults. And I think, in terms of additional thoughts around that, it's just that if in terms of revising or developing existing programs, if there are ways to build in pictures that are more concrete about helping youth identify what a positive relationship looks like, rather than just emphasizing warning signs or what a negative relationship or an unhealthy relationship would look like. And actually, Jessica and I were just talking, in some of the adult groups that we just worked with saw the map and the clusters as a really concrete tool for actually talking about healthy relationships and communicating with parents and youth in terms of specific ideas that maybe aren't just the typical falling in love or feeling happy, or things that might come to mind more immediately, but maybe the higher order concepts. So one of the things that we do hope that comes out of this is that the map, especially the positive clusters, are used in programming as a tool or part of curricula development that just gives more concrete examples of the thoughts and the actions and the feelings that would be characteristic of a healthier teen relationship.
And then I know that we have included a link to the previous paper that you've already completed. Is there a timeline on when the updates might be available?
In terms of the summary for the second part, those are due to National Institute of Justice by the end of this month, and then they tend to turn things around pretty quickly, so certainly by summer, if not sooner, so end of April, I would expect that we'd be able to distribute the online version of the supplementary work.
No, that's great, because Larry specifically was asking about that, as well as a copy of the PowerPoints. And so in terms of the copy of the PowerPoints, we'll actually have that available up on the DIBBLE website next week, as well as the recording of this particular webinar. And so I just wanted to thank both Alyssa and Jessica for the time that you've taken with us today. And so it doesn't look like there's any other questions. And so we really do appreciate the time that everyone else has also taken in joining us today. If you do wish to order DIBBLE materials following this broadcast, you can do so online at our website, and all of the orders following the live presentation of this broadcast are eligible for free shipping. just be sure to note webinar on the order form. And we do have a brief survey we would love for you to fill out as you exit the webinar. And we do read every single comment, and it helps us to create better webinars. If you have any other questions, you can feel free to contact myself by email. We also look forward to keeping in touch with you on the Dibble newsletter, where you can remain current on the issues relating to teens and young adults, as well as the funding and the research. And if you've already not signed up, you can do so on our website. The other thing, too, that we have coming up is next month, the webinar in the month of April, we're really excited about. We actually have a group of extension professors. So Craig Dart, Eric Murphy, and Jennifer Hunter are going to be joining us, and they will be talking about how they've been using some of the Dibble materials in a number of different settings with youth and young adults, everything from 4-H to financial literacy and family development settings. And so you can sign up for that webinar on our website. And once again, we appreciate you joining us today, and hope you have a great day. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.